what the 80-20 principle can do for you. Every person I have known who has taken the 80-20 principle seriously has emerged with useful and, in some cases, life-changing insights. You have to work out your own uses for the principle. They will be there if you look creatively. Part 3, chapters 9 to 15, will guide you on your odyssey, but I can illustrate with some examples from my own life. How the 80-20 principle has helped me. When I was a raw student at Oxford, my tutor told me never to go to lectures. Books can be read far faster, he explained, but never read a book from cover to cover, except for pleasure. When you are working, find out what the book is saying much faster than you would by reading it through. Read the conclusion, then the introduction, then the conclusion again, then dip lightly into any interesting bits. What he was really saying was that 80% of the value of a book can be found in 20% or fewer of its pages, and absorbed in 20% of the time most people would take to read it through. I took to this study method and extended it. At Oxford, there is no system of continuous assessment, and the class of degree earned depends entirely on finals, the examinations taken at the end of the course. I discovered from the form book, that is by analysing past examination papers, that at least 80%, sometimes 100%, of an examination could be well answered with knowledge from 20% or fewer of the subjects that the exam was meant to cover. The examiners could therefore be much better impressed by a student who knew an awful lot about relatively little, rather than a fair amount about a great deal. This insight enabled me to study very efficiently. Somehow, without working very hard, I ended up with a congratulatory first-class degree. I used to think this proved that Oxford dons were gullible. I now prefer to think, perhaps improbably, that they were teaching us how the world worked. I went to work for Shell, serving my time at a dreadful oil refinery. This may have been very good for my soul, but I rapidly realised that the best-paying jobs for young and inexperienced people such as I lay in management consultancy. So I went to Philadelphia and picked up an effortless MBA from Wharton, scorning the boot camp-style so-called learning experience from Harvard. I joined a leading US consultancy that on day one paid me 4 times what Shell had paid me when I left. No doubt 80% of the money to be had by people of my tender age was concentrated in 20% of the jobs. Since there were too many colleagues in the consultancy who were smarter than me, I moved to another US strategy boutique. I identified it because it was growing faster than the firm I had joined, yet had a much smaller proportion of really smart people. Who you work for is more important than what you do. Here I stumbled across many paradoxes of the 80-20 principle. 80% of the growth in the strategy consultancy industry, then as now growing like gangbusters, was being appropriated by firms that then had, in total, fewer than 20% of the industry's professional staff. 80% of rapid promotions were also available in just a handful of firms. Believe me, talent had very little to do with it. When I left the first strategy firm and joined the second, I raised the average level of intelligence in both. Yet the puzzling thing was that my new colleagues were more effective than my old ones. Why? They didn't work any harder, but they followed the 80-20 principle in 2 key ways. First, they realized that for most firms, 80% of profits come from 20% of clients. In the consulting industry, that means 2 things: large clients and long-term clients. Large clients give large assignments, which means you can use a higher proportion of lower-cost younger consultants. Long-term client relationships create trust and raise the cost to the client of switching to another consulting firm. Long-term clients tend not to be price-sensitive. In most consulting firms, the real excitement comes from winning new clients. In my new firm, The real heroes were those who worked on the largest existing clients for the longest possible time. And they did this by cultivating the top bosses of those client corporations. The second key insight the consulting firm had was that in any client, 80% of the results available would flow from concentrating on the 20% of most important issues. These were not necessarily the most interesting ones from a curious consultant's viewpoint, but whereas our competitors would look superficially at a whole range of issues and then leave them for the client to act or not on the recommendations, we kept plugging away at the most important issues until we had bludgeoned the client into successful action. The client's profits often soared as a result, as did our consulting budgets. Are you working to make others rich, or is it the reverse? I soon became convinced that, for both consultants and their clients, effort and reward were at best only loosely linked. It was better to be in the right place than to be smart and work hard. It was best to be cunning and focus on results rather than inputs. Acting on a few key insights produced the goods. Being intelligent and hard-working did not. Sadly, for many years, guilt and conformity to peer group pressure kept me from fully acting on this lesson. I worked far too hard. By this time, the consulting firm had several hundred professional staff, and about 30 people, including myself, who were called partners. But 80% of the profits went to one man, the founder, even though numerically he constituted less than 4% of the partnership and a fraction of 1% of the consulting force. Instead of continuing to enrich the founder, 2 other junior partners and I spun off to set up our own firm, doing exactly the same thing. We, in turn, grew to have hundreds of consultants. Before long, although the 3 of us, on any measure, did less than 20% of the firm's valuable work, we enjoyed over 80% of the profits. This, too, caused me guilt. After 6 years, I quit, selling my shares to the other partners. At this time, we had doubled our revenues and profits every year, and I was able to secure a good price for my shares. Shortly after, the recession of 1990 hit the consulting industry. Although I will counsel you later to give up guilt, I was lucky with my guilt. Even those who follow the 80-20 principle need a bit of luck, and I have always enjoyed far more than my share. This is the end of CD 1. The book continues on CD 2. CD 2. Wealth from investment can dwarf wealth from working. With 20% of the money received, I made a large investment in the shares of one corporation, Filofax. Investment advisors were horrified. At the time, I owned about 20 shares in quoted public companies, but this one stock, 5% of the number of shares I owned, accounted for about 80% of my portfolio. Fortunately, the proportion proceeded to grow still further, as over the next 3 years, Filofax shares multiplied several times in value. When I sold some shares in 1995, it was at nearly 18 times the price I had paid for my first stake. I made 2 other large investments, one in a start-up restaurant called Belgo, and the other in MSI, a hotel company that at the time owned no hotels. Together, these 3 investments at cost comprised about 20% of my net worth, but they have accounted for more than 80% of my subsequent investment gains, and now comprise over 80% of a much larger net worth. As Chapter 14 will show, 80% of the increase in wealth from most long-term portfolios comes from fewer than 20% of the investments. It is crucial to pick this 20% well, and then concentrate as much investment as possible into it. Conventional wisdom is not to put all your eggs in one basket. 80-20 wisdom is to choose a basket carefully, load all your eggs into it, and then watch it like a hawk. How to use the 80-20 principle. There are two ways to use the 80-20 principle. Traditionally, the 80-20 principle has required 80-20 analysis, a quantitative method to establish the precise relationship between causes, input, effort, and results, outputs, rewards. This method uses the possible existence of the 80-20 relationship as a hypothesis and then gathers the facts so that the true relationship is revealed. This is an empirical procedure which may lead to any result ranging from 50-50 to 99.90.1. If the result does demonstrate a marked imbalance between inputs and outputs, say a 65-35 relationship, or an even more unbalanced one, then normally action is taken as a result. A new and complementary way to use the 80-20 principle is what I call 80-20 thinking. This requires deep thought about any issue that is important to you and asks you to make a judgment on whether the 80-20 principle is working in that area. You can then act on the insight. 80-20 thinking does not require you to collect data or actually test the hypothesis. Consequently, 80-20 thinking may on occasion mislead you. It is dangerous to assume, for example, that you already know what the 20% is if you identify a relationship. But I will argue that 80-20 thinking is much less likely to mislead you than is conventional thinking. 80-20 thinking is much more accessible and faster than 80-20 analysis, although the latter may be preferred when the issue is extremely important and you find it difficult to be confident about an estimate. We look first at 80-20 analysis and then at 80-20 thinking. 80-20 analysis. 80-20 analysis examines the relationship between two sets of comparable data. One set of data is always a universe of people or objects, usually a large number of 100 or more, that can be turned into a percentage. The other set of data relates to some interesting characteristic of the people or objects that can be measured and also turned into a percentage. For example, we might decide to look at a group of 100 friends, all of whom are at least occasional beer drinkers, and compare how much beer they drank last week. So far, this method of analysis is common to many statistical techniques. What makes 80-20 analysis unique is that the measurement ranks the second set of data in descending order of importance and makes comparisons between percentages in the two sets of data. In our example, then, we will ask all our 100 friends how many glasses of beer they drank last week and array the answers in a table in descending order. 80-20 analysis can compare percentages from the two sets of data, the friends and the amount of beer drunk. In this case, we can say that 70% of the beer was drunk by just 20% of the friends. This would therefore give us a 70-20 relationship. We can summarize this data visually in an 80-20 frequency distribution chart, or 80-20 chart for short. In this chart, the vertical axis is the glasses of beer drunk, and the horizontal axis is the 100 beer drinkers. The data on the chart looks a bit like a coastal cliff. First a downward sloping hill, then a sudden dramatic drop off to a wide flat beach, then a small further drop to the sea. The big drop comes just after our 20th drinker. The beach is our middle 60 drinkers, and the sea is the bottom 20 drinkers. Why is this called 80-20 analysis? When comparing these relationships, the most frequent observation, made long ago, probably in the 1950s, was that 80% of the quantity being measured came from 20% of the people or objects. 80-20 has become shorthand for this type of unbalanced relationship, whether or not the precise result is 80-20. Statistically, an exact 80-20 relationship is unlikely. It is the convention of 80-20 that it is the top 20% of causes that is cited, not the bottom. 80-20 analysis is my name for the way that the 80-20 principle has generally been used to date, that is, in a quantitative and empirical way, to measure possible relationships between inputs and outputs. We could equally well observe from the data on our beer-drinking friends that the bottom 20% of people only consumed 30 glasses, or 3% of the total. It would also be perfectly legitimate to call this a 3-20 relationship, although this is rarely done. The emphasis is nearly always on the heavy users or causes. If a brewery was conducting a promotion or wanted to find out what beer drinkers thought about their range of beers, it would be most useful to go to the top 20. We might also want to know what percentage of our friends combine to account for 80% of total beer consumption. In this case, inspection would show that Mike G, the 28th biggest drinker with 10 glasses, took the cumulative total to 800 glasses. We could express this relationship, therefore, as 80-28. 80% of total beer was drunk by just 28% of our friends. It should be clear from this example that 80-20 analysis may result in any set of findings. Clearly, individual findings are more interesting and potentially more useful where there is an imbalance. If, for example, we have found that all of our friends had drunk exactly 8 glasses each, the brewery would not have been very interested in using our group for promotional research. In this case, we would have had a 20-20 relationship. 20% of beer was drunk by the top 20% of friends, or an 80-80 relationship. 80% of beer was drunk by 80% of friends. Bar charts show 80-20 relationships best. An 80-20 analysis is best displayed pictorially by looking at 2 bars, which is particularly appropriate for our example. Our earlier examples with the piles of products and profits can also be represented by bar charts. Imagine 2 vertical bars side by side, like 2 tall windows. The first bar represents our 100 beer-drinking friends, each filling 1% of the space, starting with the biggest beer drinker at the top and ending with the smallest beer drinkers at the bottom. The second bar represents the total amount of beer drunk by each and all of our friends. We can choose any given percentage of our friends and see how much beer they accounted for. For example, if we painted in the top 20% of the first bar or window, our top 20 drinkers, we would have to paint in 70% of the second bar or window, because that's how much beer those 20 people drank. In other words, the 2 bars would show what we discovered by putting the data in a table or in the 80-20 chart described earlier, that the top 20% of beer drinkers accounted for 70% of the beer drunk. The bar chart just takes the data and displays it from top to bottom instead of left to right. It doesn't matter which display you prefer. If we wanted to illustrate what percentage of our friends drank 80% of the beer, we would fill in the bars slightly differently to show the 80-28 relationship. 28% of our friends drank 80% of the beer. What is 80-20 analysis used for? Generally, to change the relationship it describes or to make better use of it. One use is to concentrate on the key causes of the relationship, the 20% of inputs that lead to 80%, or whatever the precise number is, of the outputs. If the top 20% of beer drinkers account for 70% of beer consumed, this is a group that a brewery should concentrate on reaching in order to attract as high a share as possible of the business from the 20%, and possibly also to increase their beer consumption still further. For all practical purposes, the brewery may decide to ignore the 80% of beer drinkers who only consume 30% of the beer. This simplifies the task immensely. Similarly, a firm that finds that 80% of its profits come from 20% of its customers should use this information to concentrate on keeping that 20% happy and increasing the business carried out with them. This is much easier, as well as more rewarding, than paying equal attention to the whole customer group. Or, if the firm finds that 80% of its profits come from 20% of its products, it should put most of its efforts behind selling more of those products. The same idea applies to non-business applications of 80-20 analysis. If you analysed the enjoyment you derive from all your leisure activities and found that 80% of the enjoyment derived from 20% of the activities, which currently took only 20% of your leisure time, it would make sense to increase the time allocation from 20 to at least 80%. Take transport as another example. 80% of traffic jams occur on 20% of roads. If you drive on the same route to work each day, you will know that roughly 80% of delays usually occur at 20% of the intersections. A sensible reaction would be for traffic authorities to pay particular attention to traffic phasing on those 20% of jam-creating intersections. While the expense of such phasing might be too much for 100% of junctions, 100% of the time, it would be money well spent in the key 20% of locations for 20% of the day. The second main use of 80-20 analysis is to do something about the underperforming 80% of inputs that contribute only 20% of the output. Perhaps the occasional beer drinkers can be persuaded to drink more, for example by providing a blander product. Perhaps you could work out ways to get greater enjoyment out of the underperforming leisure activities. In education, interactive teaching systems now replicate the technique used by college professors where questions are addressed randomly to any student in order to combat the 80-20 rule, where 80% of classroom participation comes from 20% of the trainees. In US shopping malls, it has been found that women, some 50% of the population, account for 70% of the dollar value of all purchases. One way to increase the 30% of sales to men might be to build stores specifically designed for them. Although this second application of 80-20 analysis is sometimes very useful and has been put to great effect in industry in improving the productivity of underperforming factories, it is generally harder work and less rewarding than the first use. Don't apply 80-20 analysis in a linear way. In discussing the uses of 80-20 analysis, we must also briefly address its potential abuses. Like any simple and effective tool, 80-20 analysis can also be misunderstood, misapplied, and, instead of being the means to an unusual insight, serve as the justification for conventional thuggery. 80-20 analysis, applied inappropriately and in a linear way, can also lead the innocent astray. You need constantly to be vigilant against false logic. Let me illustrate this with an example from the book trade. It is easy to demonstrate that, in most times and places, about 20% of book titles comprise about 80% of books sold. For those who are steeped in the 80-20 principle, this is not surprising. It might seem a short hop to the conclusion that bookshops should cut the range of books they stock, or, indeed, that they should concentrate largely or exclusively on bestsellers. Yet, what is interesting is that in most cases, instead of sending profits up, restricting range has sent profits down. This does not invalidate the 80-20 principle for two reasons. The key consideration is not the distribution of books sold, but what customers want. If customers go to the trouble of visiting a bookstore, they want to find a reasonable range of books, as opposed to a kiosk or supermarket where they don't expect range. Bookstores should concentrate on the 20% of customers who account for 80% of their profits and find out what those 20% of customers want. The other reason is that what matters even when considering books, as opposed to customers, is not the distribution of sales, the 20% of books that represent 80% of sales, but the distribution of profits, the 20% of titles that generate 80% of profits. Very often, these are not the so-called bestsellers, books written by well-known authors. In fact, a study in the US revealed that Bestsellers represent about 5% of total sales. The true bestsellers are often those books that never make it into the charts, but sell a reliable quantity year in and year out, often at high margins. As the same US research comments, core inventory represents those books that sell season in and season out. They are the 80 in the 80-20 rule, often accounting for the lion's share of sales in a particular subject. This illustration is salutary. It does not invalidate 80-20 analysis at all, since the key questions should always be which customers and products generate 80% of profits. But it does show the danger of not thinking clearly enough about how the analysis is applied. When using the 80-20 principle, be selective and be contrarian. Don't be seduced into thinking that the variable that everyone else is looking at, in this case the books on the latest bestseller list, is what really matters. This is linear thinking. The most valuable insight from 80-20 analysis will always come from examining non-linear relationships that others are neglecting. In addition, because 80-20 analysis is based on a freeze frame of the situation at a particular point, rather than incorporating changes over time, you must be aware that if you inadvertently freeze the wrong or an incomplete picture, you will get an inaccurate view. 80-20 thinking and why it is necessary. 80-20 analysis is extremely useful, but most people are not natural analysts, and even analysts cannot stop to investigate the data every time they have to make a decision. It would bring life to a shuddering halt. Most important decisions have never been made by analysis and never will be, however clever our computers become. Therefore, if we want the 80-20 principle to be a guide in our daily lives, we need something less analytical and more instantly available than 80-20 analysis. We need 80-20 thinking. 80-20 thinking is my phrase for the application of the 80-20 principle to daily life, for non-quantitative applications of the principle. As with 80-20 analysis, we start with a hypothesis about a possible imbalance between inputs and outputs, but instead of collecting data and analysing them, we estimate them. 80-20 thinking requires, and with practice enables, us to spot the few really important things that are happening and ignore the mass of unimportant things. It teaches us to see the wood for the trees. 80-20 thinking is too valuable to be confined to causes where data and analysis are perfect. For every ounce of insight generated quantitatively, there must be many pounds of insight arrived at intuitively and impressionistically. This is why 80-20 thinking, although helped by data, must not be constrained by it. To engage in 80-20 thinking, we must constantly ask ourselves, what is the 20% that is leading to 80%? We must never assume that we automatically know what the answer is, but take some time to think creatively about it. What are the vital few inputs or causes as opposed to the trivial many? Where is the haunting melody being drowned by the background noise? 80-20 thinking is then used in the same way as the results from 80-20 analysis, to change behaviour and, normally, to concentrate on the most important 20%. You know that 80-20 thinking is working when it multiplies effectiveness. Action resulting from 80-20 thinking should lead us to get much more from much less. When we are using the 80-20 principle, we do not assume that its results are good or bad, or that the powerful forces we observe are necessarily good. We decide whether they are good from our own perspective and either determine to give the minority of powerful forces a further shove in the right direction or work out how to frustrate their operation. The 80-20 principle turns conventional wisdom upside down. Application of the 80-20 principle implies that we should do the following. Celebrate exceptional productivity rather than raise average efforts. Look for the shortcut rather than run the full course. Exercise control over our lives with the least possible effort. Be selective, not exhaustive. Strive for excellence in few things rather than good performance in many. Delegate or outsource as much as possible in our daily lives and be encouraged rather than penalised by tax systems to do this. Use gardeners, car mechanics, decorators and other specialists to the maximum instead of doing the work ourselves. Choose our careers and employers with extraordinary care and, if possible, employ others rather than being employed ourselves. Only do the thing we are best at doing and enjoy most. Look beneath the normal texture of life to uncover ironies and oddities. In every important sphere, work out where 20% of effort can lead to 80% of returns. Calm down, work less, and target a limited number of very valuable goals where the 80-20 principle will work for us, rather than pursuing every available opportunity. Make the most of those few lucky streaks in our life, where we are at our creative peak and the stars line up to guarantee success. There are no boundaries to the 80-20 principle. No sphere of activity is immune from the influence of the 80-20 principle. Like the 6 wise, blind Indian men who tried to discern the shape of an elephant, most users of the 80-20 principle only know a fraction of its scope and power. Becoming an 80-20 thinker requires active participation and creativity on your part. If you want to benefit from 80-20 thinking, you have to do it. Now is a good time to start. If you want to begin with applications for your organisation, go straight on to Part 2, which documents most of the important business applications of the 80-20 principle. If you are more immediately interested in using the principle to make major improvements in your life, skip to Part 3, a novel attempt to relate the 80-20 principle to the fabric of our daily lives. Part 2. Corporate success needn't be a mystery. Chapter 3. The Underground Cult. Now we see in a mirror dimly, but then we shall see face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall understand fully. 1 Corinthians 13:12. It is difficult to gauge the extent to which the 80-20 principle is already known in business. This is almost certainly the first book on the subject. Yet, in my research, I was easily able to find several hundred articles referring to the use of 80-20 in all kinds of businesses all over the world. Many successful firms and individuals swear by the use of the 80-20 principle, and most holders of MBAs have heard of it. Yet, considering that the 80-20 principle has affected the lives of hundreds of millions of people, even though they may be unaware of it, it remains strangely uncelebrated. It is time to put this right. The first 80-20 wave. The Quality Revolution. The Quality Revolution that took place between 1950 and 1990 transformed the quality and value of branded consumer goods and other manufactures. The quality movement has been a crusade to obtain consistently higher quality at lower cost by the application of statistical and behavioural techniques. The objective, now almost reached with many products, is to obtain a zero rate of product defects. It is possible to argue that the quality movement has been the most significant driver of higher living standards throughout the world since 1950. The movement has an intriguing history. Its 2 great messiahs, Joseph Juran, born 1904, and W. Edwards Deming, born 1900, were both Americans, although Juran was born in Romania. Respectively an electrical engineer and a statistician, they developed their ideas in parallel after the Second World War, but found it impossible to interest any major US corporation in the quest for extraordinary quality. Juran published the first edition of his Quality Control Handbook, the Bible of the quality movement, in 1951, but it received a very flat reception. The only serious interest came from Japan, and both Juran and Deming moved there in the early 1950s. Their pioneering work took an economy known at the time for shoddy imitations and transformed it into a powerhouse of high quality and productivity. It was only when Japanese goods, such as motorcycles and photocopiers, began to invade the US market that most American, and other Western, corporations started to take the quality movement seriously. From 1970, and especially after 1980, Juran, Deming and their disciples undertook an equally successful transformation of Western quality standards, leading to huge improvements in the level and consistency of quality, dramatic reductions in fault rates, and large falls in manufacturing costs. The 80-20 principle was one of the key building blocks of the quality movement. Joseph Juran was the most enthusiastic messiah of the principle, although he called it the Pareto principle, or the rule of the vital few. In the first edition of the Quality Control Handbook, Juran commented that losses, that is, manufactured goods that have to be rejected because of poor quality, do not arise from a large number of causes. Rather, the losses are always maldistributed in such a way that a small percentage of the quality characteristics always contributes a high percentage of the quality loss. And a footnote commented that the economist Pareto found that wealth was non-uniformly distributed in the same way. Many other instances can be found: the distribution of crime amongst criminals, the distribution of accidents among hazardous processes, etc. Pareto's principle of unequal distribution applied to distribution of wealth and to distribution of quality losses. Juran applied the 80-20 principle to statistical quality control. The approach is to identify the problems causing lack of quality and to rank them from the most important, the 20% of defects causing 80% of quality problems, to the least important. Both Juran and Deming came to use the phrase 80-20 increasingly, encouraging diagnosis of the few defects causing most of the problems. Once the vital few sources of off-quality product have been identified, effort is focused on dealing with these issues rather than trying to tackle all the problems at once. As the quality movement has progressed from an emphasis on quality control through to the view that quality must be built into products in the first place by all operators, and to total quality management and increasingly sophisticated use of software, the emphasis on 80-20 techniques has grown, so that today almost all quality practitioners are familiar with 80-20. Some recent references illustrate the ways in which the 80-20 principle is now being used. In a recent article in the National Productivity Review, Ronald J. Ricardo asks, "Which gaps adversely affect your most strategic consumers?" As with many other quality problems, Pareto's law prevails here too. If you remedy the most critical 20% of your quality gaps, you will realize 80% of the benefits. This first 80% typically includes your breakthrough improvements. Another writer, focusing on corporate turnarounds, comments, "For every step in your business process, ask yourself if it adds value or provides essential support. If it does neither, it's waste. Cut it." This is the 80-20 rule revisited. You can eliminate 80% of the waste by spending only 20% of what it would cost you to get rid of 100% of the waste. Go for the quick gain now. The 80-20 principle was also used by Ford Electronics Manufacturing Corporation in a quality program that won the Shingo Prize. Just-in-time programs have been applied using the 80-20 rule. 80% of the value is spread over 20% of the volume, and top dollar usages are analysed constantly. Labour and overhead performance were replaced by manufacturing cycle time analysis by product line, reducing product cycle time by 95%. New software incorporating the 80-20 principle is being used to raise quality. With the ABC Data Analyzer, the data is entered or imported into the spreadsheet area, where you highlight it and click on your choice of 6 graph types: histograms, control charts, run charts, scatter diagrams, pie charts, and Pareto charts. The Pareto chart incorporates the 80-20 rule, which might show, for instance, that out of 1,000 customer complaints, roughly 800 can be eliminated by correcting only 20% of the causes. The 80-20 principle is also increasingly being applied to product design and development. For example, a review of the use that the Pentagon has made of total quality management explains that decisions made early in the development process fix the majority of life cycle costs. The 80-20 rule describes this outcome, since 80% of the life cycle costs are usually locked in after only 20% of the development time. The impact of the quality revolution on customer satisfaction and value, and on the competitive positions of individual firms and indeed of whole nations, has been little noted but is truly massive. The 80-20 principle was clearly one of the vital few inputs to the quality revolution. But the underground influence of the 80-20 principle did not stop there. It also played a key role in a second revolution that combined with the first to create today's global consumer society.